In the spring of 2023, a sudden ice break on a river in central Saskatchewan tore a chunk out of a hillside, and for a few days, before anyone fully understood what had just been exposed, nobody realized that the collapsing riverbank had just cracked open 11,000 years of continuous human history, sitting quietly in the layers of dirt underneath. The site is called Âsowanânihk, a Cree word meaning a place to cross. It sits within the territory of the Sturgeon Lake First Nation, along the North Saskatchewan River near the town of Crutwell. And what's buried inside that exposed hillside is forcing a real, ongoing rewrite of how long organized human communities have actually existed in this specific part of North America, and how sophisticated those communities really were. The discovery itself came down to sheer chance, combined with someone paying close attention. Dave Rondeau, an amateur archaeologist, first spotted unusual traces along the eroding riverbank in 2023, after the spring ice breakup had carved a fresh, raw cross-section straight into the hill. Erosion like that happens constantly along rivers, and most of the time it reveals nothing more than dirt and rock. This time it exposed a clean, layered profile packed with stone tools, fire pits, and bison bone sitting in undisturbed sequence. One era stacked directly on top of the next, going back much further than anyone expected to find at a site like this. Researchers, including Glenn Stewart, an archaeologist at the University of Saskatchewan, along with colleagues from the University of Calgary, began working alongside the Sturgeon Lake First Nation to properly investigate the site. A piece of charcoal recovered from deep within the exposed layers was sent for radiocarbon dating, and the result placed the site at approximately 11,000 years old, making Âsowanânihk one of the oldest confirmed archaeological sites anywhere on the North American continent. Old enough to sit comfortably alongside globally recognized ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey or the earliest phases of construction at Stonehenge. Purely in terms of sheer antiquity, here's why a date that old changes more than just a number on a timeline. The conventional picture of early indigenous peoples across this specific region has generally assumed near constant, wide-ranging movement. Small mobile bands following game across a mostly empty landscape, rarely occupying a single spot for more than a short window at a time before moving on entirely. That assumption wasn't built out of nowhere, but it also wasn't built with much input from the communities actually descended from the people being described. What researchers found at Âsowanânihk doesn't fit that older picture cleanly at all. The layered stone tools, repeated fire pits, and consistent evidence of tool-making activity, stacked across a genuinely long span of time in the same specific location, points instead toward sustained, repeated, long-term use of this exact spot, generation after generation, rather than a single brief hunting stop that happened to leave a few scattered artifacts behind before everyone moved elsewhere for good. The location itself explains why this particular spot mattered so much. Elders from the Sturgeon Lake First Nation have described this specific stretch of river as an ideal place to camp precisely because it functioned as a natural crossing point for migratory animals, particularly bison moving through the region on a predictable seasonal rhythm. Stewart put it plainly: the people living here knew exactly where the animals were going to cross the river, because the animals kept coming back to that same place year after year, generation after generation. That single detail, understanding a predictable, recurring migration pattern well enough to build a long-term camp directly around it, describes something closer to a deliberate, organized strategy than a wandering band stumbling onto temporary shelter purely by accident. Since that first discovery, the excavation hasn't stopped expanding outward. Researchers have continued extending the mapped boundary of the site, roughly 200 meters further east and another 150 to 200 meters north of the original discovery point. And at every single stage, they keep finding clear, continued evidence of human occupation rather than hitting an empty, artifact-free edge. According to Ron Doe, that pattern suggests continuous use of the site stretching across an extraordinary span of time, rather than one isolated encampment from a single distant, disconnected era. Every new excavation season keeps pushing the known boundary of the site outward, rather than confirming a tidy, contained edge. The research here isn't happening the way archaeology has traditionally been conducted at sites like this. Extracted quietly by outside institutions with limited community involvement or consent. The Sturgeon Lake First Nation established the Âsowanânihk Council specifically to lead and guide the ongoing work, with Elder Willie Ehrman among those directly involved in shaping how the site gets studied, protected, and eventually shared with the wider public. Youth from the community have taken part in guided tour of the excavation itself, connecting directly with archaeologists like Stewart on site. A deliberate choice to treat this discovery as belonging first and foremost to the community whose ancestors actually lived there, not simply as raw data waiting to be extracted, published, and quietly forgotten once the papers came out. That relationship matters enormously, because the site remains genuinely vulnerable right now, in the present, not just as a historical curiosity sealed safely in the past. Despite its extraordinary age and significance, Âsowanânihk sits exposed to real, ongoing threats from nearby logging and industrial activity. The same kind of riverside development that could damage or destroy irreplaceable layers of evidence before researchers ever get the chance to fully document them. The Âsowanânihk Council has been actively pushing for stronger protective measures, while simultaneously working toward longer-term plans for a cultural interpretive center. One designed specifically to support education, tourism, and ongoing land-based learning for younger generations within the community, turning the site into something actively lived with, rather than simply studied from a distance and fenced off behind glass. There's a broader pattern worth noting here too. Âsowanânihk isn't an isolated anomaly sitting alone in the record. Other recent discoveries across Canada, from ancient petroglyphs at Writing on Stone in Alberta to ribstone carvings uncovered at Âsowanânihk Heritage Park in Saskatchewan, have been steadily building a similar case. That the standard timeline taught for decades about early Indigenous civilization in North America has consistently underestimated both how early organized societies actually formed here and how sophisticated their relationship with the land genuinely was. Long before any of it was ever committed to paper by outside observers arriving centuries later with their own assumptions already firmly in place. Each of these discoveries alone might look like an isolated curiosity. Taken together, they start to look like a pattern historians simply hadn't been equipped to notice before, largely because nobody had thought to look this closely or this locally, until relatively recently. What makes Âsowanânihk quietly remarkable isn't just its age, striking as that number is entirely on its own. It's the fact that the very first physical clue came from nothing more sophisticated than a river doing exactly what rivers have always done, cutting into its own bank during an ordinary spring thaw, exposing a fragment of history that had been sitting patiently in place for 11,000 years, waiting for the right person to happen to notice it before the water simply carried it away for good, unremarked and unrecorded the way it very nearly did. The unwritten record, some of history's biggest stories were never written down at all. Subscribe and check out the rest of the channel, new lost chapters of history, going up every day.